Okay. Um, I know what you're thinking. It's probably the best light that was possible. I mean, we can also. Yeah, it doesn't really fetch anything. So I've been thinking a little bit about how to spend the time. If you say you want to, tell stories that your mind comes up with, which, probably the first human in history that ever had that idea. Mm, you kind of want to position yourself that you kind of work with time because especially at least right now 2026 with AI, I think a lot of things will be possible that weren't before, and I think that's really exciting because it basically lets people who want to make you know things, stories, movies, anything super accessible. So I've been thinking about, well, what are the things that aren't going to change and what are the things that make movies be bad no matter the unlimited budget. So if you think of like a movie you didn't like, maybe some big blockbuster Marvel movie. There are a few things that I keep thinking about. One of them is writing, and writing is some of these. It's such a big word that encompasses so many things, but I would narrow it more down to characters. Meaning, why do the humans that are portrayed, or the characters, because they don't have to be humans, behave the way they do, and does that make sense to us? Is that an engaging, realistic storyline? Um, that is one thing. Second, do the things that happen in the story follow the rules that were established before? So basically, you try to reverse and think about all the dumb movies you've watched, all the dumb books you've read, where you're like, why is this bad? And then you try to not do it. Things I can think of are weird, like not having a point, right? Sometimes you watch a movie or you read a book and like things happen and things go on and you're like, what is, what are you trying to tell me? What is this? I think it's enough to just have an interesting story about characters, but there's sometimes literally mediums that don't have a point. Second of all, infuriating, stupid or unrealistic characters, right? I think a lot of things like anime, and you watch these people and you're like, you guys don't act like a person would, right? You don't have the ability to form complex thoughts or emotions that make sense. You aren't a three-dimensional person. And usually I feel like for three-dimensional it's enough to have people who can like think about things in complex ways. That's enough. Like if you just don't have the I don't know, the dumb main character that has some kind of goal and that doesn't have the ability to empathize or um, thinks think about anything differently than from his perspective, that's really annoying. Unless that's a point of the character, which I don't know. Um, the opposite of that would basically just be, you take a good story, I don't know, Breaking Bad, and you're like, okay, why is this character good? Well, he is understandable based on the premise we have seen about him. So people get introduced, so they're at a certain point of their life when we see them, the characters or whatever, we learn about them, and we kind of understand why they are the way we are. They are, and we will judge them from that point on, right? If somebody is introduced as being a shy person, then we are like, why are you shy? First of all, and then in every moment behind that we will judge him on this past that we either assume or know about. So Walt in Breaking Bad is, I think, introduced as this overqualified high school teacher, and he has um, his son who has the disease, and he's kind of, yeah, I think at the beginning of the show it's where basically his like students watch him have a second job to make some money. Or I think he gets fired. I don't remember. Basically, the reason this show works so well is because at no point are you questioning whether a human could behave this way. Um, and this consistency is extremely important and difficult, and I think a lot of shows fail because lives are complex, and I think we really like watching humans do things. And so we need to know who they are, we need to connect with them, we need to understand them, even if they're completely different from us. As long as we can understand how it could have happened that a person has this outlook on life, which is where, great villains, for example, come from. It's not like we understand them as in we would behave this way, but we understand how a human could end up in this position, and that's very interesting. So that's one of the main points, and this will never be outsourced by AI because essentially writing and humans. I mean, I don't even think actors will be outsourced with AI. Even if you could have perfect AI replicas, we would still want a human perform these human actions. First of all, because I think it would literally take a way longer time to get AI to actually have like a Leonardo DiCaprio level acting. I don't even think this like literally physically. I'm not sure if that's ever going to be possible to like even even if there was some kind of like humanoid mesh and you could with perfect prompts and you have 1,000 things you could change to like literally make that humanoid behave exactly in the way you want, and he would be consistent and you could change things about him and it would absolutely be perfect. I think that would still be more work than just having an actor. So why would you do that? And this would be 20 years in the future. So there seems to be a certain value in being able to both write and portray these characters, and technology won't really outsource that. That's one thing. Second of all, things like all the taste matters. So composition, where a camera is, what sounds are used. It's not like it's not going to be easier to, have virtual cameras, have um, easier access to sound. Maybe you can spin up AI, whatever, but it will just execute things that you understand. And so you have to practice taste. You need to understand why you use a certain camera angle or movement or a certain sound, and this taste will always be rewarded. So there seems to be a high value in practicing that. Um, I'm trying to think about movies that I've watched recently that were like either really good or really bad. Um, I watched the new Avatar movie, um, the Airbender, not the blue people, and actually a lot of people were pretty unhappy, and I was a little confused because I thought I was really going to like that movie because it looked so incredible, which is kind of the syndrome I'm talking about. So um, I think for many people it failed basically exactly in those departments that I was talking about. Characters, so characters that were either established before and now aren't really acting in a way that would align with their life, and that feels really confusing because we're like, felt like I knew these people and now they're behaving differently. That doesn't make sense. That is dumb. How they interact with each other, so they all have relationships with each other, which is also something that's both important and also really difficult. And then for the general things that happen in the world to make sense. So it's like it all comes down to logic. Like, could this happen this way? Now, the next question would be, I guess, is there a story that could be really bad, even though it has interesting characters that change, that interact with other characters, and a world that completely makes sense, and the story is still bad? Um, could that ever be the case? I mean, I guess the story has to still be interesting, right? Like you could just have mundane life of people, and then you would watch it at the end and be like, well, it was done very well, and I kind of understood the character, but why should I care? Like, what is the point? There's nothing happening. I think it's comes down to like the heights and lows of humanity. So we have, love, sex, death, all the horrors that humanity do, and all the positive things humanity do. And most of the stories that I've at least listened to, read, kind of come down to these 2 points, right? We have humans affecting each other, systems affecting each other, and consequences that arise from that, right? If you watch something like Arcane, you have a city that is divided. You have all these characters that grow up and have a certain perspective, and there's something inherently tragic in humanity because we never have the ability to fully grasp how our actions affect each other. And the problem is that humans just make mistakes because we don't know everything, and we have to make these mistakes. So there all these complex things that happen that like build up the society, and now it's kind of in a state that's really suboptimal when it comes to just making everybody feel as good as possible. And then a person grows up in that system, and they're you know the people from the undercity have to behave in a certain way to survive, and the people that have it really good don't really have the ability to see the consequences of all their actions, right? You can't It's really difficult to blame a kid that grows up in a society like that, but it makes sense how someone who grows up really poor has a certain feelings about it, which is, I guess, the actual pillar of humanity, which is we experience life, and then we have certain feelings about that, which leads to certain actions. And this big problem, basically, like the good thing but also the problem of that we can never fully transmit our feelings to our action, because there will always be a slight delay. I would say it's like the emotional equivalent of somebody in a car stopping and everybody behind them having to stop, and then this big line forming, and people not, an hour later have to read the consequences. It's just not possible. In the same way, a person has an emotion based on the variability of life. We live in a perfectly idyllic world. There's a kid, and for some reason, he still, because he has limited perspective, feels treated unfairly, right? He feels jealousy, he feels hate, he feels, all these negative emotions that humans have, even though the world is perfect. And so he behaves a certain way. Maybe he makes a mistake. Then somebody else just sees him doing it. He has no idea about the emotions that caused this kid to behave this way. And this then chains off another thing, which is where we, like, these small chains create this big cycle of, tragedy, hate, in some ways love. People will always, a lot of hate comes from the losing of love. So I think that's like the core of what makes stories interesting, right? Things just happen to Walter White. He is kind of living a normal, more or less fine or idyllic life. He has emotions like everybody else, and then something happens, something tragic, something that is, again, this variability of life. In the same way, the rest of his life kind of is based on these variables. Um, and these things literally happen all the time, just by the chance of big numbers, right? There's literally today probably 100 people got cancer on this world, which is terrible. And there's I don't know 100 people who got married and now have a kid and are super happy. I don't know, whatever the positives are. And then Walter gets cancer and he behaves as humans do, right? We have emotions and we kind of have to deal with that, and so he acts in ways. No one would blame a person that just found out he has cancer to be super erratic, but maybe he has a fight with someone, um, and because he's so emotional and the other person doesn't know what's going on, the fight escalates, They like, I don't know, they have a fist fight. There's an accident and he like throws him out of the window. It's not necessarily, you know, a like the person who has cancer who like started this fight because of emotion isn't a bad person. But so tragedy happens, and then this is how stories escalate basically. And if I think about good things, I mean, there's complex stories like Game of Thrones, like Arcane, like Breaking Bad, like whatever. Kind of this core of humanity's tragic fate to forever be in these loops. We will always have things that just happen that affect people, that then affect everybody else, that affect everybody else. And we would basically have to, like, as a collective, have this huge culture of fighting back these irregular behaviors of the universe. Where we basically would have to be like everybody who has something bad happen to them, everybody who gets cancer gets like all this attention from everybody else, the perfect amount they need to deal with their own emotions and to be fine, or to like deal with grief and death and not keep these chains going, which is impossible, literally impossible. Which means there will always be really interesting stories to tell, and you can always make up rules of the universe. You can always have a new connection of these different elements that make up a person. All the different nuances that create a person that got to a certain point where this one thing happens, or multiple things happen that cause a certain behavior that has a ripple effect to the humans around them. And the more interesting those are, the more interesting the rules of the universe are, and the more interesting the connections between other characters, their whole complicated backstories, and then how they make these decisions and how these things interact with the whole storyline. This is what makes a good story. And this has basically nothing to do with budget, right? How many times have I watched a movie and thought, it looks really beautiful, but it's bad and it's just dumb. And on the other hand, I've literally watched movies that cost like $20,000, which means it's like accessible for almost every person, if they save for a decade. And it was brilliant. It had things to say. It had what is it called? I think it was a story about a person who had made an AI who was looking like a kid, something like that. It was really interesting. And so we have the concept, so the point to make, which is usually the most interesting points are these questions we can't answer. What makes a good person? When, what makes someone conscious? Can a robot ever be, what makes humanity? What happens after death, right? All these things that humanity kind of ponders, and we never kind of get to that point. So there they fulfilled this first premise, which is just having a point, asking interesting questions, and then having a story develop from there. Then we have a character who's this man, and we like slowly learn things about him and about why he made this AI, and we have other characters that kind of interact with him. And he's totally understandable. Like, we learn about his backstories, we kind of learn how he chooses to see these things based on the things that have happened to him, and that makes it interesting, because a human he has a pretty tragic backstory, and so he has a very interesting relationship with this interesting question. Interesting character, interesting story, interesting question, interesting subject, and so all these interactions are enough to make us want to see it. We want to learn it, and it then chooses to tell a certain outcome of the story and make a certain point, and you can do a bunch of those. But at its core, it has literally nothing to do with what you see. There's, of course, like this minimum viable version at what point things would get too confusing if I shot this movie here in my room, right? Because I think at its core, good media creates feelings in the viewer. right? That's what makes any form of art valuable. And the art, I think, is pretty difficult thing to define in the first place, but a painting matters to people because they look at it and they feel something and they want that. If it is the feeling that it cost a bunch of money, then that's that. But I think for most people, it's like, this is cool. And we have certain associations why this weird picture is cool, or it, makes us feel calm or whatever. But we value our own human experience, basically. And that means that the ability to have other humans feel thing is the value, right? If you if you wanted to talk to it from a business perspective, the reason we like books that make us cry is because we like being alive and we like experiencing, imagining, and kind of stimulating our brain in the short time that we are alive. And we like to feel, enriched, and like we have a bunch of experiences, and media is a way to have experiences that we couldn't experience. We can't really experience the feeling of a lifetime or witnessing a certain character, even though we would maybe in a weird way like we would like to see Walter White's story if it didn't have all the consequences for us. If we could be there in life in the real world, I think a lot of people do that to a certain point. I mean, I don't know, reality TV and stuff. Um, but books, movies, and things like that are a way of taking all these interesting parts and just presenting it to a person so they can then start feeling things. Which is why I talked about this. There is a certain limitation. I can't forever swear off to this shitty camera and this shitty light, because if I wanted to, tell the story of someone's wife dying, a tragic thing, humans, and we have these two people, and they kind of, we need to like, to make the viewer feel something, we need to learn about these people, we need to care about these people. And the problem is, if I make it here, then I think there's a good chance you're always being taken out of wanting to believe and feel the story, because you're always like, things are not real. We need to trick the viewer's brain to immerse themselves in the story. And I think the fallacy is that people try to make a bad story very believable. So they get the Marvel budget, they have a story that we don't care about, because I feel like what makes the Marvel movies actually great is we have these really interesting stories with these really interesting characters, and then they interact with each other, and then things happen. That's why we like them. We like when Tony Stark and Captain America talks. We have humans with certain lives, with certain personalities that are, they have all these values, and then when they have their funny quip, even though it's simple entertainment, we like feeling the experience of witnessing these exceptionally interesting humans. Bold prediction. Um, but based on that, and me kind of, at least right now, believing what I'm saying myself, the like percentage of how I should use my time to require these skills, which a skill is just me trying something, see if I feel something, me trying something, see if I feel something, and you do that over and over, and you try to learn as much from the humans that have came before you. Um, why get really good at making people believe, the space a character is in is real in the story that we tell, when you don't care about the story? And especially since, because technology will keep rising, I think especially the second part will get easier and easier. It will be easier to, use technology, green screens, software, whatever, to generate this world. Makeup, lighting, backgrounds, props. I don't know. I just feel like, at least with the pace we're on right now, it will become easier. And what will never become easier is understanding humans and emotions, right? Which makes great storytelling. So that's my kind of self-check wrap up of how I will create my practice, and which is what I will be evaluating basically myself on. And I think what I'm gonna do with, because the uncomfortable truth is I keep trying to make these things, and you kind of have this block because everything looks so shitty here. Um, but I think kind of trying to go for, what if I could make you care about a character that looks like me, that exists in a space like this, right? That would prove the actual value. So if I can make an interesting story with shitty equipment, that's 1,000 times better than making a shitty story with really good equipment and a bunch of money. And the truth is, if somebody gave me, 50 million bucks now, I just couldn't make a good movie because I just don't have a story to tell, right? I just lack so much skills. Um, so yeah, see you. I'm really trying to make my anxiety of how shitty the things I make and the contrast between my taste and my ability to create things. I really try to get it down and upload more of my actual creations. I've basically not really made past. I mean, I made like a scene, and then I made the second version of that scene, and that's it. That's how scared I am of making something I care for, and how hurtful it is to have the huge gap between your like. Again, I think it's like taste to ability. That's the huge pain point. Like you consume so many good media and books, and you have this work of people who are like decades ahead of you, and you're like, man, I would really like to make something, and then you like are just confronted, and you have to like brutally reel back in the feeling that we're not trying to. First of all, what you make is not, you know, connected to your worth. You can just make something bad without having to feel bad about it. And second of all, we're trying to improve between takes, right? We just have to make something that gets better, not something that is good. Because eventually it will be good. And you're just not patient enough to actually, like, how much time in practice will it realistically be? 5 hours, 10 hours over like the last 20 days, I think, something like that. And then the 15 videos I made 10 months ago. So that's nothing, right? It's like nothing. If I did 100 hours of something, I would still think it's nothing. And I think that's a really point probably everyone who wants to make something has to kind of go through. Like you just cannot avoid the part where you suck and you have these thoughts and ambitions and you don't know what you're doing, but you also, maybe you slump in your improvement, and so you don't get any satisfaction, and it's going to take years for any of this to even feel like you're getting better. But that's the point. And I think it's also, if we want to be a little bit more snarky and want to have a very competitive view on this situation, it's also what all your competitors have to go through. So if you want to, like, you just take the 8 billion people, and there are all these, really successful filmmakers, they just went through that phase. Maybe they did it when they were a kid, and so it was more acceptable. But in general, if I take 100 humans with me and I say, hey, you all you're all equally bad at making movies, then the one who's gonna like win at the end of 100 days is usually just the one that got to tolerate the discomfort of sucking more because he practiced it more often. You make something, it's shitty, you make it again, and the one who does it the most kind of wins. If you improve something every time. And there are probably people who improve a little bit faster, but in general, it's that thing. Do it often, improve every time, and then you try to crank up the volume of these iterations. That's it.